Arcanine was arguably one of the most powerful cards to come out of the base set era, and it did have a pretty good deck in that metagame. However, it was outclassed usually by faster attackers. And later on in a new format, it was still the same. Blaine's Arcanine still had an attack that dealt high damage for a high energy cost, but it was still much less preferred than Blaine's Ninetales, which could attack a lot faster. So that metagame really didn't treat high damage cards really well unless they could get that damage off on turn 1 or 2. But after some sets rotated and the Rocket On format was in full swing, Blaine's Arcanine began to tick a lot of boxes that made cards great in this format. It had high HP. It had an attack that built up over time and was really great late game. It could abuse some trainers really well. And finally, it had some support. And that support was in the form of Typhlosion. Typhlosion had a great ability in Fire Recharge that would let you flip a coin and if heads attach a fire energy from your discard pile to one of your Pokemon. This allowed for a lot faster turnaround for those Firestorm attacks so that you could deal 120 damage over and over again more consistently. Cleffa and Professor Elm would make it so you could get a lot of fire energy in your hand. You could play Blaine to get them onto Arcanine a lot faster. And then after you use Firestorm, you can use Typhlosions on your bench to get those fire energy back out of your discard and back onto Arcanine as fast as possible. So with a setup that could let you hit for 120 damage and basically OHKO everything else in the format, almost every single turn, this made for a pretty powerful deck, especially very early on in the Rocket On format. So the basic build of this deck is pretty much exactly how you would expect it to be. As I've said in the Feraligatr video as well, every single starter Pokemon had 2 versions of all of its evolution line. So I opt for the Cyndaquil that has more HP. I much prefer survivability over its ability to attack because you're not really going to be attacking with Cyndaquil or Quilava. So a full playset of Quilava as well. And also, much like Feraligatr, I only run 3 copies of Typhlosion in this deck, partly because you're usually not going to need more than that, but also because the Typhlosions are still pretty expensive despite being out for a really long time. And you get yet another example of a card that relies on coin flips to be effective, which is very appropriate for the Rocket On format. And you're not going to be using that Flame Burst attack very often. However, you can use support from Blaine and your own ability to get some fire energy on there. If your opponent happens to double gust out your Typhlosion, then you can really rely on it a little bit. It doesn't have a terrible attack, but you're usually going to be keeping a Blaine's Arcanine or a Cleffa as your active and just using that Typhlosion on your bench for support. The ideal is going to be having 3 Typhlosions on your bench. That way you can get 3 coin flips and potentially get 3 energy from your discard back onto Arcanine right after it discards those 3. And you also have the option to play your energy per turn back onto Arcanine as well, or play a Blaine. So a full playset of Blaine's Growlithe. This is the one that knows Stoke. There are I think maybe 3 Blaine's Growlithe across the 2 gym sets, and a full playset of Blaine's Arcanine since it is your main attacker. Cleffa's in here for the consistency. It lets you get those fire energy in your hand over and over again. That way you can play some other trainers like Misty's Wrath and get them in your discard so you can start using Typhlosion very early game to power up Arcanines faster and potentially even get those Firestorms off on turn 3 and then start using Blaine's in the late game. That way you can save them. Professor Elm's going to do a lot of the same where you're refreshing your hand so that you get a whole new set of cards, a lot of fire energy in there so that you can get them in your discard or attached to your Arcanine. Misty's Wrath can be really helpful for your setup early game. Not only are you getting cards that you need out of your deck faster, it'll give you a way to get your Arcanines and Typhlosions into your hand a lot faster, but it also puts fire energy in your discard, which kind of gives you a head start in using Typhlosion's ability to get those back. So if you get a pretty good setup, you can start out early game with a Misty's Wrath to get a lot of fire energy in your discard. You can use Blaine to get more of them out of your hand and onto Arcanine so you can start firing off those attacks earlier. And by turn 3, You can have 2 or 3 Typhlosions on your bench, using its ability to get back Arcanine's 3 discarded Firestorm energy so that it can use that attack over and over and over again and potentially get knockout after knockout after knockout. The only real problem you're going to run into is, of course, baby Pokemon or anything that has a focus band attached to it. That's one of the reasons that Double Gust is in here instead of Warp Point, is because it is very important for you to be able to choose what your opponent is going to have to drag out from their bench. That way you can avoid baby Pokemon or anything with a focus band on it if possible. That way you're getting a guaranteed knockout. Goldberry is in here instead of focus band just because Arcanine with 90 HP, it's pretty solid. The only stuff that's going to OHKO it is going to OHKO it no matter if it had 90 HP or 120. So Goldberry is pretty useful for that reason, but also if you need to rely on Heat Tackle for a couple of turns, if for some reason you can't get that 4th Fire Energy, you can Heat Tackle a couple of times and then Goldberry will heal off that damage between turns. 2 copies of Cinnabar Gem, primarily for Feraligatr, really. You don't want your Arcanine to be knocked out by like a Feraligatr that only has a few energy in the discard. At least make them work for it a little bit. So you get Cinnabar Gem down and you eliminate that water weakness, which is actually a pretty big deal in this format. And it's also good for a counter gem, so that if your opponents are trying to play stuff that helps them out, you can actually just throw down a Cinnabar Gem, even if you're not against any type of water Pokemon. Nightly Garbage Run just gets a couple of your evolution cards that can be necessary back into your deck. If you Misty's Wrath and you actually have to throw away a bunch of Quilava or something, then Nightly Garbage Run is just like an emergency card so that you can get those back into your deck and potentially get them back by playing another Misty's Wrath or refreshing with Cleffa. So this is the clean, solid, kind of bare bones version of this deck. Of course, tournament builds are going to look a little different so that they can accommodate to whatever the metagame is for that area. And of course, the deck has some pretty big weaknesses that can be exploited, the biggest of which is Typhlosion not being a great attacker. Because it's a support Pokemon, it can always fall into a Double Gust or a Warp Point and have to become your active. The good news is it's got a pretty solid amount of HP, and it's got an attack that isn't impossible to use. You can definitely get off a Flame Burst, but also Typhlosion isn't going to be able to benefit from Cinnabar Gem or the Blaine Trainer card. So one addition you could make for this deck is to take out a couple Double Gust and replace them with Chaos Gem, which is going to stop your opponent from using a lot of trainers. So trainer-heavy decks, like Feraligatr, are going to have a lot of trouble if you have Chaos Gem out. So you do have that as a backup as well. And if you don't have your Typhlosion set up quite yet, you may have to rely on a few Heat Tackles from Arcanine at first. In this case, Arcanine's going to be dealing some damage to itself, which has Goldberry support. That way it's going to be healing off. But you could use this deck in a way where you're using Focus Band instead of Goldberry. If you're really afraid of Arcanine being OHKO'd, which it definitely can by decks like Feraligatr that can deal really high damage late game, then you should also be incorporating Metal Energy into this deck. That way you can put it on an Arcanine or a Typhlosion that also has Focus Band on it. That way you are also taking less damage from the recoil of your own attacks. But this is really a strategy just for dealing with Feraligatr decks and mirror matches against other Arcanine decks. In playtesting, I really preferred this build of the deck against Steelix, Machamp, and some big basic decks that aren't really gonna deal over 90 damage in a single turn, so the Focus Band doesn't seem really worth it. In those matchups, it was much more beneficial to heal off that damage and keep a high HP instead of just surviving on 10 damage and just being able to attack for one more turn before you're knocked out. And although this deck is weak to Feraligatr, which basically ruled the format at the time, it did get to benefit from Feraligatr as well. Very late in the Rocketon metagame, a lot of grass-type rogue decks started showing up just to deal with Feraligatr, and in those cases, Typhlosion Arcanine could deal with those really well because then they had the advantage over all of these rogue decks that were popping up. That late in the metagame, this deck really suffered more from being stalled out than anything by baby Pokemon, by Focus Band, and mainly by Pichu. So If your opponent had a Pichu with a focus band on it, it could use its Zap attack over and over again to deal damage to all of the Typhlosions that you had on your bench at the time, which really dealt a heavy blow to this deck because after 5 zaps, if your opponent could get them off and actually avoid being knocked out by a Heat Tackle, then you could be put in a bad spot. But also, if you're relying on Heat Tackles to knock out your baby Pokemon, you're also dealing damage to yourself. This deck can also be shut down pretty hard if your opponent can predict your future turns by playing Goop Gas Attack. If they know that you're going to be able to set up an Arcanine in a single turn by using multiple Typhlosion, or if they've been able to look at your hand with something like Secret Mission and they know that you've got Blaines in your hand, then they could play Goop Gas Attack to make it that Typhlosion can actually get those energy back for one turn at least, which could be enough to knock out that Blaine's Arcanine. So as always, leave me those opinions and comments down in the comment section. Let me know about any decks you would like to see featured on my channel, and as always, thanks for watching, guys. Until next time,